Chapter 9, Qualitative Research Methods. There are several reasons why we may want to employ qualitative research methodology. We may want to explore a topic of interest that perhaps hasn't been explored in the literature, describe something in more depth versus just quantifying it, verifying something that you found with a quantitative study, identifying a problem, or evaluating a situation or a phenomenon of interest. The types of research questions in a qualitative study are unique from quantitative studies. So here we're not dependent variables. We're not necessarily just looking at differences or relationships, but we're really trying to understand the nature of a phenomenon of interest. Qualitative studies, therefore, will not allow us to assess cause and effect relationships. But many times the questions are much more open-ended. So they may be real general. For example, what is the nature of living in a small rural town? It's not very specific as to what I'm looking for. It may be the social interaction, the availability of resources, anything that the participant brings to the forefront then becomes important. So that's a more open-ended type of research methodology than specifically narrowing down your variables of interest, as we did in some of the quantitative studies that we talked about. What is it like to be a surgeon, right? We can then interview surgeons and just ask them, what is it like to be in that frame of mind? What is it like to undergo, to go through an operation and to be the one responsible for caring for this patient? And so in a qualitative research methodology, we're simply interested in understanding something in more depth. And so therefore, the data that we collect will be verbal, qualitative data. Research methodology may not be determined in advance. Many times with qualitative studies, since we're allowing the participants to guide which direction we go into. For example, if I say to someone in that example of what is the nature of living in a small rural town, if they start emphasizing the politics of living in a small town, then that's the direction that we're going to go into. If they're talking about the resources, then that's the direction that we're going to go into. So the participants have a large role in shaping the direction that the researcher then pursues. It may continue to evolve over the course of the study, and it does require considerable preparation and planning so that you can have an ample opportunity to explore all avenues that are possible avenues to understanding the phenomena of interest of your study. There are several types of qualitative research designs. We started talking about several of these in a previous lecture: case study, ethnography, phenomenological study, grounded theory, and content analysis. Let's go through each one in turn. Case study. A case study could be an individual, a program, or event that is studied in depth. So for example, many times, especially in psychology, we think of case studies as looking at one single individual. The reality is that with case study, we can look at an entire case. So for example, an entire school, or an entire hospital, or an entire institution. Any of those are potential options for a case that we can investigate in more depth. Typically in these situations, we're interested in learning something about a phenomenon that is poorly understood. What is it like to work in an alternative high school? And so we want to study that entire case. You see this in psychology a lot, a particular case of psychopathology, and we want to understand that case in more depth. Many times qualitative studies, particularly case studies, are used as a springboard for then initiating a quantitative study. The limitation, of course, is that the findings for one case study may not be generalizable to other people, situations, or groups. And this is the case for most qualitative research, that it's limited in generalizability However, the strength is in really understanding a particular case in depth, and the goal is not always to generalize results. An ethnography is an in-depth investigation of an entire group that shares a common culture. Within an ethnography, we can look at an ethnic culture, which is typically what we think about, but it can also be the culture of a school environment, the culture of a hospital. So even when we're talking about an ethnography, although a starting point is thinking about ethnic cultures and the study of those cultures, but we can also think about cultures, subcultures, how a particular neighborhood has a culture. Many times it's site-based fieldwork performed in a natural setting, so where it is that that culture is found, and it must be performed over a long period of time to fully understand the nature of how that culture plays out. We typically have contact with informants, individuals who can give us rich information about what it is like to be part of that culture. And it often involves what's called participant observation. Participant observation is when the researcher then becomes part of the group. If it's a school, they go to the classrooms, they interact with students, they interact with teachers, they interact with staff. If it's a hospital, they interact with doctors and nurses and all the other staff that work at that hospital. They become part of the environment, and they're no longer just researchers studying a phenomenon of interest. With all qualitative studies, the goal is to identify patterns and themes that emerge. Within ethnography, it's used to describe explicit cultural patterns, so patterns that are specific to that cultural group. It's formulated to describe beliefs and assumptions of that cultural group and really look below the surface, so dig deeper, understanding the reasons why people practice certain customs, belief systems, and again, not just within an ethnic group, but even within a community group, subculture, etc. Phenomenological study is a study that is interested in understanding a phenomenon of interest. This could literally be anything that one is interested in, whether they're interested in understanding behaviors of those who are sports enthusiasts, understanding what it's like to be a stay-at-home parent, a stay-at-home dad, a stay-at-home mom, what it's like to be a librarian. It can be absolutely any phenomenon of interest to the researcher. The study attempts to understand people's perceptions and perspectives of any particular experience. It could be a small sample. So here we can ask several who all have the similar characteristics. There are lengthy, unstructured interviews to really get into depth and understand the phenomenon of interest. Again, themes and patterns that emerge are recorded and then used to explain the phenomenon of interest under analysis. Grounded theory is a little bit more in-depth qualitative study. The goal of a grounded theory is literally to develop a theory. So they collect data to begin to identify, again, patterns that emerge in order to explain a given phenomenon of interest, a behavior of interest. Data analysis begins immediately. Data are organized into categories until what the term that's used in qualitative studies is until the data is saturated. So saturation is the goal. So to what extent do we feel like we've collected all of the possible information about this topic of interest? So there's really no endpoint that's identified before the study begins. So we just want to see that the data is saturated. So we have fully explored everything that there is to know about this particular phenomenon of interest. And until the researcher feels confident that they've accomplished that, the grounded theory cannot